We have a lot of ground to cover today, talking about a new competitive landscape, one which features economic, fiscal, capital, and venture capital growth. But is this Asian performance sustainable? Does it have the force? Does it have the magnitude to alter the distribution of power from the West to the East? I'm turning the page. Can Asian nation states take a global leadership role in the areas of diplomacy, military strength, technology, and soft power? Beats me. But one thing's for sure, and that is, as much as the Middle Kingdom would like otherwise, it's not all just about China. Will the 21st century be the Asian century? Many believe it already is. Here with us today are these guys here, Curtis Chin from my far right, Senior Fellow, Executive in Residence, Asian Institute of Technology. He's the former U.S. Ambassador to the Asian Development Bank. To my immediate right, Timothy Dattels, Senior Partner, TBG Capital. To my immediate left, Hori, President and Dean, Globis University, Managing Partner of Globis Capital Partners. To my far left, Sunny Verghese, Group Managing Director and CEO, Olam International. Let's start off with Yoshi. Yoshi, from your perspective, what's happening in the East?
Okay, thank you, Ray. It's good to be speaking first for a change. Japan has become quite popular after Abenomics. And there has been quite a lot of mention about Japan on the global overview in terms of the economy. I'm the only panelist from Japan in the entire conference, so I'll talk about what's happening in Japan. After 2 decades of deflation and 2 decades of stagnant economy, we had a new landscape coming up, and lots of Japanese people are quite excited about. And in terms of, I'll give you some numbers. After November, when Abe became, or was most likely to become prime minister, stock markets were jumped about 50%, and yen has depreciated about 25%, and then unemployment rate has dropped to 4.1%, and stock markets and also real estate markets have jumped, as well as corporate earning is expected to make about 30% earning. And then you see that there's excitement in the air. And what is Abenomics? Abenomics, we always talk about 3 arrows. And 3 arrows come from the story from the country, from the region where Abe-san was born and raised. It says, with 1 arrow, it could be easily be broken. With 3 arrows, it's not easily be broken, so that you should have 3 arrows. First arrow is fiscal spending. And fiscal spending, because of Mr. Kuroda, who was a former governor of ADB, became a governor of BOJ, and he has started target 2% inflation rate, and then started unprecedented easing of money. And that's the first arrow. Second arrow is fiscal spending, fiscal policy in a way that additional investment from the government is about 2% of GDP has been added into the country. Therefore, lots of businesses going in terms of government-related, and then therefore it's pushing in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. Third arrow is a growth policy, and it's a structural changes. Japan has decided to join TPP, and at the same time, there's women workforces. We have decided that 30% of leadership in Japan will become women by 2020. And therefore, there will be a lot more deregulation, structural changes, and also trade liberalization is happening. And that's are the 3 arrows. And therefore, right now, Abe is now supported quite well by the Japanese people with 70%, over 70% of support rate. And there's excitement in the air. Whoever has visited Japan since November, you see there's drastic changes into the air and the people's mentality. I'll give you 1 or 2 examples because I run a venture capital firm together with running a business school. One example is that our firm has made 2 IPOs this year. The 2 IPOs, both of them, has the initial price at the market is more than 3 times, 4 times bigger than the offering price. 4 times bigger than offering price, the initial price. And we were able to sell all our holding in 2 days. That's a strong volume that we are seeing. Therefore, you can see that there's a strong momentum in terms of stock markets with 4 times higher in terms of initial price versus offering price. The second example is that we also run a venture capital firm, and therefore we have to raise fund. Before this fund, which we are raising, we had more than 80% of capital come from overseas. So only 10%, 20% portion were Japanese. But this fund, we are expecting to have about 60 to 70% of capital coming from Japanese investors. And therefore, you can see that the landscape has changed in terms of more capital flowing in, and the more money coming in. And then at the same time, the government is so bold enough to do whatever they had to do. And at the same time, like Professor Rumini mentioned about, there are some concerns. However, he said about 5 things have to be done in simultaneously. One is fiscal spending. Second is monetary policy and fiscal policy with fiscal consolidation, and the wages up and consumption up, and the structural changes, and then trade liberalization. So far, it seems to be going well, but we have to wait and see. Otherwise, the interest rate might come up, and that might have a strong burden on the Japanese economy. With that, I'd like to stop here.
Tim, your perspective. Thank you.
When Perry asked me to speak today, I thought we'd do something a little different. There's been so much focus on China. I thought maybe let's try to focus on where some new opportunities are in Asia, and certainly at TPG. And I'm going to rip through about 7 or 8 slides quickly to talk about ASEAN, where we made a substantial pivot about 5 years ago, and it's been a pretty interesting place to be. And it's what I think belongs in the BRIC moniker as the ASEAN group of countries. And it's hard to talk about the range of countries in this market, but they are moving towards a non-tariff market in the next couple of years. We have a population here of 600 million people, and so about half the size of India, but a GDP that's about 30% greater than India. So this is a very substantial trading block, and a lot of businesses are starting to scale throughout the region and create substantial value for investors. And I think this is one of the trends in Asia. It's still in the semi-experimental phase, but it's a very interesting time in the development of the Asian markets. It also reflects what's happening in Asia, which is less direct reliance on U.S. trade, because the bloc is trading now more with Japan and with China. And it will be a beneficiary, too, of the Japanese flooding of capital, which is more difficult to invest in China. We're seeing in ASEAN. Let me go to slide 17. And it's been reflected in the markets as well. These markets in ASEAN have been the highest performing stock markets in the world in the last couple of years. So they are getting richly valued, and they're getting attention. They're relatively thin markets, and it's showing up in valuation, slide 18. As you can see, on a multiple basis, Indonesia, which is really the most important market in ASEAN. The panel yesterday was pretty fascinating, and it was a tremendous panel, but it's trading at about a 40 to 50% multiple premium to China, which is a big bite to take. Slide 19, you should expect volatility if you're looking at Asia to be an investor. It's part of the market psyche. They're thin markets. There's a bit of an elephant in the pond phenomena. When large investors or capital pools move in, the markets are thin, they go up quickly, and they can go the other way quickly. If you look at slide 20, I call it the worst to first phenomena. If you were the strongest market last year, you better watch out the next 2 years, because there's a phenomena in China and Vietnam and other markets having outperformance and then severe underperformance. So, you just need to be prepared. But slide 21, if you start thinking about what's happening in these markets, there are very powerful long-term macro drivers. Indonesia is one of the great success stories in deleveraging. When markets deleverage, it is a fantastic time to be invested. After the Asian financial crisis, this country was completely wiped out, completely destroyed from every corporation, from every entity, when the currency went from 1,500 rupiah to north of 12,000. Since that time, it's gone from the most leveraged country in the world to one of the least leveraged countries in the world, 18% debt to GDP. That is an amazing achievement for any country. And on slide 21, Indonesia has the consumption model that China aspires to. Over half of the GDP is domestic consumption. You have a massive emerging consumer class. It's the 4th largest country in the world. It's in control of its economy, and it doesn't have to print money to get that benefit. If you flip to slide 24, let's skip one over to 24, what we're seeing is this incredible emerging class of consumer. And then GDP crosses 4,000 to 5,000 GDP per capita, like it is in Indonesia. It moves beyond basic consumption into more accelerated consumption and more sophisticated consumption. But if you look at the demographic curves, which we all study from a macro standpoint, it's very interesting. You can remember this conference as the date that China had more people leaving the workforce as entering the workforce. So it's turned over. Indonesia is 20 to 30 years away from that happening. So and it's true throughout ASEAN. They're very young economies, they're very young population, and they're emerging very rapidly. So just a couple of things, slide 25, they have a massive cost advantage to China and the rest of the developed market, 4 to 10 times depending on the country, cost advantage. So we're seeing a lot of basic and more sophisticated manufacturing moving into the ASEAN countries. There's no question that China has higher reliability, and that is very, very important on production chaining. And the companies like Li and Feng will continue to have very strong businesses in China. But this is a very powerful trend, and this is gravity, and it's going to continue to, production will move to the countries in ASEAN that are the most stable, where businesses can get things done. And I think that's one of the phenomena. If you look at today in the Philippines, which is the hottest market last year, slide 26, this is the big advantage of the Philippines. It's actually very well educated workforce. It's a large workforce. They're a major service economy. They've exported people, whether it's nursing, cruise workers, construction workers, everywhere in the world. All that capital comes back to the Philippines, and the ambassador will recognize that from his time in the Manila. If you flip to slide 27, guess what? They've had pretty good politics, and the rating of the current president is very strong. They've had very strong direct foreign investment and a ratings upgrade. So that deleveraging that occurred in Indonesia is occurring in the Philippines. I wish it was the same in every country in ASEAN. If you flip to slide 28, I was in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago. They are in the middle stages of a banking crisis. The only way you like looking at this slide is if you turn it upside down. It's a very difficult domestic banking situation right now, and it's a very difficult market to invest in Vietnam because the one good news in Vietnam is they finally have inflation under control. So it's gone from high double digits, 18, 19% to 6%, and that is a good foundation. I'll leave you with one or two last slides, page 29. Malaysia, which is in a very interesting election cycle right now, has a very interesting advantage. It has a major cost advantage to Singapore, which, in addition to being the wealthiest country in the world, is also massively expensive. So the logistics in Malaysia are about 85% as good as Singapore, and a massive cost advantage. So it could be interesting to watch what happens. So this is a region to watch. It's an exciting time in the region. The political forces are always fascinating, and I know we got a bunch of political experts from the region in the audience, so stay tuned.
Curtis.
Thanks. When I was first invited to speak here, the question was, will this century we're in, the 21st century, be Asia century? And I'd like to say up front, no. But I'm going to do a little bit twist. I think it will be the Asia-Pacific century. And to echo former Secretary Rubin yesterday who spoke, America is very much part of the Asia-Pacific century. And so when we talk so much about Asia rising, I hope people don't forget the tremendous opportunities here in the U.S., but also what the U.S. will do to take advantage of Asia. I spent 4 years under Secretary Paulson and then Secretary Geithner in a funny kind of role, sitting on the board of the Asian Development Bank. I'm honored. I see President Wolfowitz out there. But most people know the World Bank. Most people have no idea what the ADB is. But really a financer of infrastructure, fighting poverty throughout Asia. And since I stepped down and joined a regional, kind of a think tank focused on Asia, people ask me, who will be the next BRIC? That next Brazil, Russia, India, or China, really to drive the global economy. And just, over these last 2 days, I've heard so many acronyms. There are people talking about the MIST, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand. There was people talking about the pigs from Europe. So I'd like to do a little bit of a twist. And I said, when I look at all these markets, part of it goes back to definition. The Asian Development Bank, the World Bank defined Asia probably so differently than most of us. And even when I look at some of these terrific slides, for the ADB, Asia is somewhat 48 countries that goes all the way from Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Caucasus states, throughout Central Asia and to the far-flung Pacific Island nations. And so in many ways, indeed, Asia is rising. But when we talk about Asia, often people are talking about key nations in Southeast Asia, key nations in East Asia. They're generally not talking about Pakistan, although there was an interesting slide someone showed yesterday that said Pakistan had the best performing stock market if you looked at over the last 5 or 6 years. But probably few of you are invested in Pakistan. But maybe there's an opportunity there. So I say to people, when I think about the nations of Asia, so diverse. And really when I look at a country, I think about what I call the little brick. It's not another nation out there, but it's what I call the challenge of bureaucracy, regulation, interventionism, and corruption. And if I were to assess every Asian nation, some will do much better than others. We, the United States, aren't so great in some of these measures when you look at us compared to, say, Singapore. When we look at Transparency International's perceptions of corruption, I think the U.S. is 17th or 18th. Singapore might be 3rd or 4th. So it's not like the U.S. will necessarily be the model for the world. But I think so much that is driving Asia's growth isn't because of the World Bank or the ADB or individual governments, but we're freeing up people to pursue business, to pursue opportunities, and ideally to develop capital markets that will bring in some money to further drive growth. Let me stop by just saying, when I came here, I thought, I'm really a New Yorker, so LA is a whole different world to me. So I thought I need an LA story. But I'm on so many planes, but on one plane ride, I watched this movie called Looper. Any of you have seen it. It's Bruce Willis and I think some hip star, Joseph Gordon something. But basically, they play the same character. So Bruce Willis is talking to the young Bruce Willis. And the young Bruce Willis is in a diner studying French. And so the old Bruce Willis says to the young Bruce Willis, what are you doing? And he says, I'm studying French. I want to go to Paris. And the old Bruce Willis says, I'm from the future. Study Chinese. And to me, like the zeitgeist, the talk is all about China. But I would echo already what's been said on this panel. Whether it's a good thing in the long run, to be honest, for Japan or Southeast Asia, everyone's now talking again about Japan. But generally, it's always been about China. So I would say to people, there's a lot of money to be made and lost in Asia. But I think we should be looking broader than China or Japan. And even, last Monday I was in Burma. Everything's about Burma now. There's always something that's like the flavor of the month. But I think in any of these Asian countries, it's really getting in and doing your due diligence and seeing what is that right company or opportunity and not simply say, I'm going to invest in, if someone comes up with a Burma or Myanmar fund, that's got to go up. But yeah, Asia is rising, but let's not forget the rest of Asia and the Pacific, including the United States.
Sunny.
Thank you, Ray. I think to your question, whether this is going to be the Asian century, from an economic standpoint, I think the center of gravity is clearly shifting. But from an overall broader definition of power, I think we are truly getting to a more multipolar world, and I don't think there'll be a single country or a single region that would dominate. My role in this panel today is to really look at two key significant trends, what I would like to call game-changing trends, and the resource implications of that, and what does it mean to us as a planet in terms of how we're going to cope with it. The first clear game-changing trend is the growth in the middle class. And if you look at that growth in the middle class, today we have about 1.85 billion people in the middle class around the world. And that grew by about roughly 750 million in the last 30 years. But over the next 20 years, we expect to add another 3 billion people to that middle class. And we're going to go up to 4.85 billion people. That is something that we have not witnessed in our lifetimes, and that is truly game-changing. Now, 90% of this growth in the middle class is going to be centered in Asia, and two countries in Asia will have most of that growth in the middle class. Today, Asia contributes about 0.53 billion out of the 1.85 billion middle class population. And that is going to grow by another 2.88 billion in the next 20 years. And Asia will have about 3.23 billion people in the middle class. And the consequences of that is very profound, and we'll just try and understand what the implications of that are going to be. And the second game-changing trend is the revolution in urbanization that is occurring in these markets. And Tim briefly touched upon what's happening in Southeast Asia. But of the 600 cities that are going to be the most important from an economic contribution to global economic activity, 136 of these will be in Asia, and out of that 100 will be out of China. China today has got an urbanization rate of 50%. India is at 30%. And if you look at Chinese growth, the explosive growth that we saw over the last 30 odd years, it really started when China hit the 30% urbanization rate. So I think India is now on that inflection point, and we'll see fairly significant growth as a result of this urbanization. It is not just India and China, and as Tim mentioned, it's across Southeast Asia where there's a massive revolution in urbanization. And that has also got profound implications in terms of resource intensity. What does it mean? Let's take some of the critical resources and what that implication would be. First, from an agricultural land standpoint, China today has about official numbers, 124 million hectares under cultivation. We don't believe that is true. We believe it's less than 121 million. The red line in China for food self-sufficiency, which is defined by them as 95% food self-sufficiency, means that you need about 120 million hectares of agricultural land under cultivation. And in the last 15 years, that has declined by a CAGR of between 0.5 to 0.7% per year. While the Chinese government is very worried about the decline in arable land due to urban crawl and urban sprawl, or due to desertification, alkalization, salinization, and all of the pollution issues that we have in China, and they had very strict laws in 2004. 2004, China had a food crisis in terms of dramatic reduction in agricultural production. So the Chinese government passed very stringent laws about converting any arable land into commercial real estate, and particularly put a moratorium on building any new golf courses. Since 2004 to 2010, roughly 500 new golf courses have come up in China on arable land that was classified as wasteland and therefore could be used for anything else. China will, in my opinion, between China and India, they will begin to import between 15 and 20% of their food in 2020. Today, China and India are net exporters of food. I don't see they have a hope in hell of being self-sufficient in food production in the next 20 years. And that is because every car, for example, that is added to the fleet population, which is one of the impacts of urbanization or one of the impacts of industrialization, you have to set aside 0.074 hectares of land to support that car in terms of roads and parking lots and garages and everything else. China today has 58 million passenger car fleet population. And one estimate is that it will grow to 450 million by 2030. And even then, the car use ratio in China will be that of Croatia's or South Korea's. Even at that kind of car usage ratio, Chinese fleet population is expected, passenger fleet, not the total transport fleet population, passenger fleet population is expected to grow. 50 million hectares will be taken out of cultivation. 50 million hectares is roughly half what China has under the 4 major food crops. China has 20% of the world's population, roughly 8% of its total fresh water. So today, China imports its water by importing soybeans, for example. 60 million tons of soybeans. The best way of, because water is very local, you can't transport water and trade water across borders. So the best way to try and meet a shortfall is to import. So they imported 60 million tons of soybeans, which is roughly 60% of global trade in soybeans. If they have to just become self-sufficient in one crop, soybeans, they have to put an additional 33 million hectares of land into cultivation, which is 1/3 of the total land that they have under all food crop production. The water tables in China and India, because of the overexploitation of groundwater aquifers, is receding at an alarming rate. In the north part of China, it is receding at 3.5 meters a year. And the northern part of China grows 50% of its wheat, 40% of its corn. In the northwest part of India, in Gujarat, for example, water tables are receding at about 6.5 meters per year. Most parts of that country is now deemed water constrained by the UN. We today consume about 4.5 trillion cubic meters of water. By 2030, we need 6.9 trillion cubic meters. 71% of this water goes into agricultural use. about 22% goes into industrial use. There's going to be tremendous pressure on water resources. If we can fight a war over oil, I think we should be very worried about the kind of geopolitical consequences food and water security can create. And if you'll be surprised, we all consume roughly 3,600 liters of water per day in the US, because we consume 3,600 calories here on an average. There's a rough rule of thumb: for 1 liter of water, for 1 calorie, you need 1 liter of water. So your breakfast is about 1,000 liters of water, whereas for your whole domestic purposes, you use about 50 liters of water. So there's going to be a major constraint on water. Energy, the primary energy demand growth is going to be about 166 QBTU. Q is a quadrillion British thermal units, the growth between now and 2030. 60% of this primary energy growth demand is going to be in China and India, which means China and India together will increase that energy demand by 100 QBTU in the next 20 years. The whole world increased the primary energy demand in the last 20 years by 100 QBTU. Just India and China in the next 20 years will account for 100 QBTU growth in primary energy demand. So whether it is energy, whether it is land, whether it is water, and on top of that, we have climate change issues and impacts. The IPCC Committee on Climate Change has said that the Himalayan glaciers are likely to melt by 2035. It supports 6 or 7 major river systems: the Ganges in India, the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, the Indus in Pakistan, the Irrawaddy in Myanmar, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River in China, and the Mekong Valley in Vietnam. All of these 6 river systems together support about 1.4 billion people engaged in these drainage basins for their agricultural purposes. So the 4 critical developmental challenges that we face because of this above trend growth in Asia is going to be food security, water security, energy security, and the impact of climate change. 66 gigatons of carbon dioxide we will emit by 2030. That means world temperatures could rise between 4.5 and 5 degrees centigrade. Last 100 years, world temperatures have grown by 0.8 degrees centigrade. And that has created havoc in weather patterns. God forbid if temperatures go up 4 to 5%. And that will create serious disruptions. My objective was not to make you feel reassured, but to really make you feel restless about the challenges that we face. Thank you.
I have a question. I mean, China makes an impact. I mean, China will soon be the world's biggest economy. Everybody knows that, and it's expected. But for example, the relations with Japan, how does that impact hobbyism right now? What does this government think about the relationship, and how does it? Can you speak to that?
Okay,
yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah.
Okay. Abe's thinking is not to think Japan, China as a bilateral. He thinks more globally. He thinks about Russia, South Korea, and Australia, United States, ASEAN, India. Therefore, he is now in Middle East right now. Before that, he was in Russia. And then the first visit he made was in Vietnam, in Thailand, and then Indonesia, and he was in the US. And therefore, his thinking is more global, and he tries to have a stronger relationship with other nations. And then at the same time, his door is open to China. And that's his policy. But regards to economic, I think Tim mentioned about China. And I was thinking about there's a broad subject and agenda going on with the panelists. And I thought that what is in common, and what do we think we should talk about? It's more could be like free flow of capital and trade liberalization. And in that sense, China is different in terms of free flow of capital, and then in terms of trade liberalization, they are not a part of TPP. And we didn't talk much about TPP, but I'm sure TPP has a strong impact onto that region, like Asia Pacific region, because now that Japan has decided to be in, and it has about 30 to 40% of GDP is in TPP already. And so that kind of trade liberalization and free flow of capital, and then Tim mentioned about lots of Japanese yen is flooding into ASEAN because of free flow of capital. But in case of China, it's different. Therefore, there will be some debates as to whether or not that kind of system is going to be sustainable in the future to come.
Will China join the TPP at some
No.
point? Curtis, you probably.
I certainly can't speak for China, but I think you have an important point that when we think about how Asia is developing, China has presented a very different model for development. I always like to say, why don't we in the United States or in Europe set an example? Let's not tell people what to do, but they will want to emulate us. And in a way, China has done that with development. For all of its many faults, and there are many faults in China and how it treats its own people, they have been successful in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And it was interesting, some of the figures that were shared earlier. We talk about one of the great stories of Asia right now is the growing middle class. But I thought it was a very realistic presentation of the realities of Asia right now, where Asia, just because of its size, I counted as 40, 45 countries, Asia still has, 60, 70% of the poorest people in the world. Just because of the raw numbers, I think it's something like 1.7 billion people in Asia still live on less than $2 a day. So China has tremendous challenges, but I also think the reality is that China's recent behavior is pushing the Philippines, Thailand, and other countries. I don't want to say necessarily closer to the United States, because they all want to they don't want to take sides with anyone. They just want to build their economies, have better lives for all their people. They don't want to be in a battle between the West and China. And I think China knows that. Hopefully China is also modifying its own behavior. I have one more little Hollywood connection where last week I took the road to Mandalay. I guess none of us are old enough to remember that Bing Crosby film. But the road to Mandalay was kind of illustrative of what is going on also in Asia. The road to Mandalay, just from the airport, it's a beautifully paved road, financed in part by the Chinese because of sanctions and all. They weren't able to get capital in other ways. That road is still kind of empty. I remember Mark Mobius once commented he kind of likes it when there's traffic jams in a country that their infrastructure isn't yet there because it suggests the potential for investment and growth. That road is still kind of empty, which to me goes to, we all talk about Burma, but we're not quite yet there in terms of what it will be. But that road was also lined with plastic bag garbage. There was just garbage everywhere. And to me, I think another trend, and we hear a lot about it in China, is the challenge to the environment. As these countries develop, and we all know, those of you who go to Beijing regularly, it's so polluted. But it's not just pollution in China. It's garbage and plastic bags everywhere, on the road to Mandalay, because countries, in addition to food, water, energy, are also struggling things with solid waste. They're struggling with sanitation. And like our own country, for those of you from the United States, governments need to make decisions as to where they're going to put the money they have. And as these economies, as these countries have developed, maybe rightfully, maybe we would have done the same if we were running those countries. Let's focus first on feeding our own people and giving them a little bit better life. And then later on, we'll think about pollution, garbage, water issues. But clearly, this also will be one of those constraints to development in Asia beyond my little brick. So countries really need to think about how they handle this as they move forward.
Well, aside from China, what do other Asian nations think about the pivot, the U.S. pivot to Asia from a military perspective? Anyone? Sunny.
I think for Asia, it's important to remember it's not one country. And clearly, China and India are rivals in more than one sense. We can see the saber rattling between China and Japan. We can see what's happening in the South China Sea and the tensions there. So I think apart from ASEAN, which Tim described, and which is different from the European Union model, where they didn't try to impose a supranational body and transfer sovereignty from the countries to that body. And they didn't follow a foolish notion of having a single currency. And I don't think, while there was a lot of talk in the past about it, I think that's now dead and buried. So for the countries in Southeast Asia, they would see the US as a more neutral arbiter for the interests in the region and as somebody who will keep the peace. And that goes for South Korea, that goes for Japan, and that goes for Philippines and the other countries in the region. So I think US's influence would be very important. China will be seen slightly variedly by the neighbors. And while the smaller countries will see the impetus that China's growth will have on their economies, the mid-sized and larger countries would be a little bit worried about the potential for China to become a hegemon in the region. So I think they will always look to the US to maintain the balance. And therefore, the role of the US in the region will continue to be extremely critical to maintain that peace and balance.
Well, if the United States is the peacemaker, you know, what is the notion of this anti-Chinese sentiment, or anti-China sentiment, I should say, how do people factor that in?
So, first of all, if they all got along,
Right.
there'd be no hope for guys like me over there. So, you know, it's like there's some benefit, but it's a huge opportunity for the U.S. But it's delicate. You know, the pivot is a constructive thing. You've seen the activity, particularly marine activity, which had sort of faded a little bit. CIMPAC's much more active in the region now. You know, the Vietnamese, I think right now the South China Sea is a major issue. I think Sonny's point on water is the next point, particularly when the flow in the Mekong River starts becoming more diverted to the north by the canal project and the dams that are, you know, huge in Yunnan. By the way, Sonny, the headwaters of these rivers are all within 60 miles of each other, all five. It's an amazing phenomenon. So it's a major issue. But I just think it's delicate. And the muscularity, I mean, so China has much greater muscularity in the region, and they're very good at bilateral discussions with their neighbors, where negotiating with a bloc becomes more difficult, because then you start getting into APEC negotiations, which includes the U.S., and it becomes a much more complicated scenario. So I think it's delicate, but, you know, let there be no doubt, China is the exporter of capital in the region as well. They have $3 trillion of foreign reserves. They're major investors in infrastructure in the market. They're major investors throughout the region. And it is the #1 market because of production chaining. So the U.S. it becomes a secondary market, because as China moves up the production scale, you know, the ASEAN countries and all the neighbors, Taiwan, are providing parts and doing the lower level manufacturing that's flowing into China that then is re-exported to the United States and Europe. So, you know, China is critical. You know, it's how to just sort of, this scenario is balanced that's important, and try to avoid the flashpoints. When there have been flashpoints, you remember when in the Bush administration with the spy plane incident, you know, just remarkable diplomacy that, you know, can you imagine if a Chinese spy plane was shot down off the coast of California? I mean, it would be a completely different scenario.
Great
and
movie.
So the scenarios have been handled very, very well diplomatically, and so I think you just have to watch for these flashpoints and pressure points, because they will be major events.
You know, you had asked about the so-called pivot to Asia. You know, I'm no longer in the Obama administration or the Bush administration. But, you know, I regularly say to people that, you know, I think the official language now, maybe it's a rebalance versus a pivot. But my hope is that our U.S. government, or all of us here who are business people in the U.S., can be part of that rebalance, meaning that it needs to be more than about defense and diplomacy, right? I think China is successful because it's not necessarily their military or their diplomats. It's Chinese business people, it's others that are also engaged. And even those of you here in the United States, some of you will see these Confucius Institutes, which I think are probably paid for by the Chinese government, which helps people if you want to study Mandarin, which is a terrific thing. People should study Mandarin in addition to Spanish or French or the range of languages people can study. But I think the United States will benefit from a broader pivot or rebalance to Asia that includes educational outreach, business outreach, cultural outreach. And I think this administration, prior administrations have done it. But the rhetoric isn't necessarily there, and there's some key things that they could do to reinforce it. You know, I argue that the United States could do more, for example, in pushing for open skies agreements. These are agreements between countries that will help liberalize kind of the traffic back and forth. Also, there's been much talk of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal. I can't remember if it was the then U.S. Trade Rep Sue Schwab announced prior to President Bush is leaving. You know, it's many years later and we're still not there. It's almost like I wish that we would also recommit to free trade agreements and recognize that sometimes bilateral ones will happen faster than these multilaterals, just because of the complexities of trying to get so many countries to work together. In my fear, it's a way to get nothing done. Can we focus on smaller ones even as we continue to push for the TPP? So I think there's some very specific policy things that the U.S. government could be doing to almost rebalance the rebalance, to make it a richer pivot or focus on Asia. And that'll be the benefit not just of the United States, but of the region, because it'll be a more almost like a pivot that's more than about where we're putting defense assets, right? And I think we're moving there, but I think business people will be a key part of it.
Yeah, I see some people are making a move towards that free lunch. Perhaps we should take some questions from the audience. You, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to have a microphone. Hold on 1 second, please.
Right here.
Question is for Hori-san.
Yes.
The demographics of Japan aren't changing.
No.
The population in Japan is obviously aging, and given Japan's immigration policies, homogeneous traits, and the demographic challenges, are the near-term actions that Abe is taking and the recent economic activity in boon, is that sustainable in the long term?
Okay. Well, what we are discussing about is the utilization of aging population, means people above 60 years of age. And at the same time, we are utilizing women more on the workforces, with committing 30% of leadership role will be women. At the same time, we are started to discuss about immigration, very slightly. And therefore, we are talking more about that kind of sustainable model for Japan.
Just a follow-up on that. Is there any discussion about change the work laws? Because there's a gigantic temporary worker population, and it's really marginalized women and young people.
Yeah.
It's so hard when you want to hire someone in Japan, you have to worry about permanent employment. I don't know how you bring women and young people into the workforce and have that demographic without changing the work laws.
That's a great point. And as an employer myself, the work law in Japan is too much regulated. And there was a discussion with the Prime Minister about changing the work law so that firing will become easier. The reason why we have more temporary workers is because firing is difficult. Yes. It's impossible. If firing becomes easier, we don't need any temporary workers. And therefore, that kind of like a liberalization of work law is now being discussed. But it's a very sensitive issue. Therefore, right now, before the election, it's being shelved, but it will come back after the election in July.
Do you think the more industrial countries of Asia would have to spend significantly more on defense now that countries like North Korea are basically showing that the United States is not able to project its power in that region? I mean, they made it pretty clear. So like the South Koreans are thinking of making nuclear weapons, nuclear reactors, all kinds of things. Maybe there must be policy reconsiderations in Japan, and that could really throw the whole region into a big problem. What do you think of that?
Who wants to talk about the wacky North Koreans?
Let me just talk about briefly. There's a tremendous change happening in Japan in terms of mentality of people. First one was because of tsunami and earthquake, and people thought that we became more patriotic about the society, because society has manifested like a good people and a good community. And the second change is because of the Senkaku issue with China. Last year in September, we saw lots of cars being bashed, and then like AEON supermarkets are being fired up, and then we saw lots of riots attacking Japanese corporations. That changed the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Abe had no choice to become Prime Minister after this is his second term. Before September, he was not even a choice. But because of that incident, we felt that we need to have a stronger leader. And therefore, Abe came into power. And then Abe has increased the spending, military spending, by marginally, but he has sent a message that Japan will stand up. And what's happening in terms of North Korea and Senkaku Daido issue in Southeast China Sea is a major impact on Japan. And we are now discussing about changing the constitution because we need to defend ourselves, and we need to defend our territory as well. And that kind of change is happening. And then at the same time, Japanese leaders, like business leaders, have started to talk about, let's say, like ex-China Asia or China +1. That means that after we saw what happened, why do we have to stick to investing to China? Let's do something, let's find somewhere else like Bangladesh or India or some other places where we can have more markets. And that has a strong impact because we have been so persistent and at the same time enduring the relationship. However, that last September has totally changed the mindset of people. And so that because of Abe coming into power, we have to be strong enough to defend ourselves. We have to be strong enough to have a strong economy. That kind of mentality came up with that kind of North Korean issue as well. So it's a major, major impact.
Well, China has very little investment in Japan, but it has investment in Asian countries, heavy investment. Is that something that you guys think will continue?
For me, I don't know the data about China investment in Japan, but China tremendously benefits from, say, Japanese investment in China. So my hope is that whether or not countries decide to spend more in military, it's at least done transparently, right? I'm not going to say you should spend more or less, but one of the challenges is we don't always know what is going on, whether it's military spending or even economic data. Sometimes, particularly out of China, sometimes the figures, you wonder if they're real. Right? And so there was a session here today about how do you know if a Chinese company is telling you the truth as you consider investing. It was a fascinating discussion. But I think, China, we all talk about China, but China also knows what we say, and my hope is that they're also factoring it into as they think about their behavior. Every government, though, has to play to domestic audiences. We do it in the United States before elections. And remember, China just had a leadership change. Japan has just had an election. Korea has just had an election. I think, as you know, Malaysia will soon have an election. And so sometimes things get done for domestic reasons, but my hope, my perpetual hope is that reason will win out and that people will realize that we do need to take a step back and really get back to focusing on what government should be doing, working to provide a better lives for their own people.
Karen?
It's me, Paul Wolfowitz.
You're not Karen, but
yeah. She's much
prettier.
Anyway, fill in the blank any way you want to. There. Including definitely better looking. My question's about China, and I'll try to make it compact. In a couple of years, by almost any measure, China's per capita income, China's middle class will be larger than any other country that the Freedom House and its index categorizes as unfree. And it begins to me to smell of South Korea in the 1980s when this growing middle class eventually forced a very dramatic and actually quite successful political change. But it seems to me that China has suppressed most of the ingredients that made that change successful in Korea. It's incredibly brittle. Just one measure of it is that when the Jasmine Spring, remember that's what it was called, broke out in Tunisia a few years ago, they banned the sale of jasmine flowers and even removed a video on the internet of Jiang Zemin singing a jasmine song. That's not a sign of a government that understands how to accommodate those forces, and I wondered if anyone on the panel has a comment on that.
I'll take that, Tim.
Paul, you know more about that than any of us here, but I would say that the new administration, there's a couple of things about them that are different. I think that the last administration, a lot of Chinese call it the lost 10 years. And I do think you have a much more forward-leaning, modern group in this new government, senior government officials, the Politburo in China. They've been educated, they've spent time offshore. The internet is something that they have a very good grasp on, but there's now more internet users and more internet spending in China than there is in the United States. And that force is extraordinarily powerful. The question is, can they manage, and the competency level of the leaders in China, to me, is incredible in general. You also have an economic team that is, for a large part, Zhu Rongji's economic team, who, in my mind, deserved a Nobel Prize in economics, one of the great reformists of all time. So I'm a little more hopeful that you start seeing that kind of more openness and dialogue and political reform. And some early signs, when the small amount of bird flu started in Shanghai, they were right on it. There was no hiding, there was no debate, there was no issues. So I'm a little bit optimistic. I just don't know where it goes. You know, that's the challenge. What is the scenario? You can start with Hong Kong. What's a scenario in Hong Kong for universal suffrage? How does that reflect and rebound into China? And you know, what is a democratization in there? I'm not sure. So I'm optimistic. I think that is that 5 to 10 year window, the second half of this new administration, to me is going to be very, very interesting. I think for the near term, it's probably comfortable.
Karen?
Hi, I'm the Australian Consul General in LA, and I spent 20 years of my career in Southeast Asia, including about 8 in Indonesia. So what I'm hearing up here is music to my ears, I have to say. Australia is one of the founding members of APEC, has sort of long said this is part of the region and the US should be there. On the TPP, I agree it shouldn't just be strategic, it's economic sense for the US to be in the region, and welcome to Japan, that was a great outcome. Can I ask you, how are you going to bring the private sector along with you? It's fine for Washington to be saying TPP's one of the things we want to achieve, but how do you bring business along with you? I mean, what you've been saying here today makes perfect sense to Australians, but how do you...
Indonesia and Southeast Asian
Yeah,
business,
yeah.
you don't have to worry, it's there.
Yeah.
It's all over. I mean, you know, every U.S. business, you know, a lot of people ask me, so, oh, you want to invest in China, who do you buy? I say, buy Procter & Gamble. You know, they have the best U.S. business in consumer products. They're all over Southeast Asia. They're all over Indonesia. And keep in mind, Indonesia is one of the few countries in the world where you could always take money in and could take money out. There's very few countries like that, including the United States of America, where you could do that, where you could say that, even during the financial crisis where the whole country was destroyed. So to me, it's open for business. You need local partners. You need to have very good fingertips. The corruption index, you know, the corruption is there. It's palpable. You can see it. You can smell it. You can feel it. It's visible. There's no issues, but open for business and completely, and I can tell you every major U.S. institution and global institution are all over the markets. I wouldn't worry about the business community. It's there as long as the returns are there and as long as people are getting a fair deal and can participate in this.
No, but I would argue, though, that a government, I don't want to say just should get out of the way, but there's some very specific things I find in terms of the rhetoric or tax policy from Washington that hurts American businesses that want to go overseas. You know, one that many people are talking about now is there's a new law where almost like if an American has a bank account overseas, the bank has to like report every single transaction if you have over a certain amount of money. You know, and so I have many anecdotes of now banks that do not want to take American business people or just regular people, and so you can't have a bank account. This is hurting people. I'd say also rhetoric-wise, I would wish from Washington, it doesn't matter what party you're Republican, but I wish there was also recognition that business success overseas won't always necessarily mean exports. Coca-Cola, Chevron, Ford Motor, terrific business entities, terrific business success in Asia. But it means they put American overseas or they're hiring people in Thailand or Singapore. For me, that's a great thing. Because we won't always have the ability to say, well, I won't have Ford in Asia. I only want Ford in Detroit to sell every car to Asia. So I think there's some very specific things that we could be doing to support American business. And one thing on China, I began by saying, Asia is so many things, 48, 44 countries. But for me, there's also not one China, President Wolf. And so when I think about China, even way back when Deng Xiaoping began to experiment in what became Shenzhen, my hope is that China will also continue to experiment once this new government kind of feels it's firmly in charge, and that maybe there'll be some experimentation that will allow some of that increased liberalism or liberalization that I would want, that maybe they can't do at a national level. And to be honest, they can't always necessarily control what's happening in the provinces or certain municipalities, and they're also struggling to control that dynamic too. I think like everyone on this, I'm very hopeful for Asia, I'm very hopeful for the United States. But there's a lot of money to be made and also lost in this place, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't be engaged there if you're not yet engaged there.
Well, just as a very, very quick aside, Perry, I'm hoping next year at the Global Conference that we will have a panel on how to get your money out of China. That would be awesome.
Yeah,
That would be
that's a good
awesome. Another question?
Actually, I'm an education journalist from India. I was quite disturbed to hear about, the forthcoming water crisis, and when you link it with the increased defense spending over there, do you foresee that perhaps, the investment in developing human capital, i.e. education, is now in danger? Because as we saw in the demographics, there's a huge youth population, say, in India and China. So obviously, if you're going to spend more on defense, you're going to spend less on education, or you've got to take the money out somewhere else. So how great is that danger, or is that being factored into your discussion?
Sunny.
The combined defense budgets globally today is between 1.6 and 1.8 trillion dollars. Therefore, priorities in terms of government policy with regard to developing human capital or developing food security or developing energy security, all of that is dwarfed by the spending on defense. And that, I don't know how that is going to change. So I think we have to just accept the fact that we need to find additional money to come into these areas, and probably it's not going to come out of a trade-off of a lower defense budget in favor of education or investment in human capital or any of the other things. Just on agricultural research, for example, currently it's about the FAO Committee of Experts on Food Security basically said there should be about $45 billion spent annually on agricultural research to find the next level of productivity breakthroughs, because agricultural productivity has declined to about 1% from historic 2.2% between 1960 and 2000. It was about 2.2%, and then it started declining because most of the low-hanging fruits have already been picked. So now if you want productivity breakthroughs, you need significant more additional investment in research.
More education, actually.
You need more education. Yeah, that's very true. Today,
in India, the agricultural productivity is very low.
Yes, it's one of the lowest. Yes, and the number of students enrolling in agricultural universities has come down. The average age of the farmer globally in agriculture now is 60 plus. So none of his children want to get into farming because they are looking at more glamorous jobs in the city, and therefore that's a crisis. Yeah.
I think someone in the third row had a question. No. Any other questions? You, sir.
Sure. No one mentioned about Hong Kong, and maybe some people refer that this Hong Kong is part of China, but
Hong what?
Hong Kong is a
I'm just
financial, financial hub of the world is Hong Kong right now. And I didn't hear anything about Hong Kong. I know there is 50 more years of before the full transition, but I spent a lot of time there. It's really the financial hub of anywhere in Asia, transactions and so forth. If any comment can be made, I would appreciate that.
And they have huge ducks in the harbor.
That's right.
Right.
big ones.
Tim?
So, I spent a lot of time in the capital markets in Hong Kong in my career, and it's, I think, the best place. It's the best capital market in the world. You can transact quickly. There's a rule of law. Markets are effective and efficient. You can have a whole debate around the basic law and how quick is the transition politically, but man, I tell you, that's one pragmatic place. They always figure a way out. It's, I worry a little bit about that. I don't know when the U.S. dollar compact breaks down, because they're basically a U.S. dollar economy. So if you get dollar inflation, it can really cause havoc there. But it's massively benefiting from the fact that the capital markets in China are not moving forward at the rate of pace that they would hope it to. So, one of the issues in China is that, you have $3 trillion of capital, and, the stock market is the worst performing stock market in the world. It's very cheap. And the reason is that there's not many high quality companies listed in the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and there are a lot of financials, and entrepreneurs can't get capital, which again allows people that are exporters, importers of capital into China to operate. And Hong Kong is the hub. It's completely dominant in my mind, and I think it will continue to be for a long time. So, I wouldn't sell your Hong Kong real estate yet. I mean, it can be a bubbly place, but every time there's been a correction in that market, they have a real estate correction, they crash, they come back. It's an amazing place and resilient, and I think they have the right alchemy. Singapore has done a great job, particularly in the private wealth management side. But the regulations in Hong Kong, the way the market works, it's going to continue for a long time.
You know, I say a part of me. I used to represent the Hong Kong government, but I no longer work for them. But I remember in those days, I was always delivering my messages about why Hong Kong is better than Singapore. But now I just speak for myself. I was in Hong Kong last Tuesday, and sometimes I fear, but maybe driven by media, that sometimes I fear that Hong Kong's great strength, which isn't just rule of law, but has recently been its closeness to China, will also become its weakness. And again, near term, maybe next 10 years, Hong Kong, what a wonderful, great place, whether to invest, to live, or to work through Hong Kong and to be engaged in China. But Singapore will give it a run for its money, to its great credit, because Singapore isn't just focused on China. Singapore really was how many things were financed in Burma, in Myanmar, when there were sanctions. Singapore, not just physically, but almost like mentally in a way, is much closer to Southeast Asia, South Asia, in addition to, of course, the Chinese overlay, the Chinese part of Singapore. So yes, Hong Kong, amazing place, but I think I'm also hopeful for Singapore, right? And then as Hong Kong becomes more and more part or close, or however you want to phrase it, connected to China, there's always these little anecdotes about the latest intervention or subtle influence from the central government about what's going on in Hong Kong. And the most recent was about disclosure of addresses of corporate directors, in a sense, almost like where it was easier to get information in the old days, but now less easy. And people are saying, oh, they don't want to be kidnapped. But the reality is, if you're going to kidnap someone, I'm sure you can find out where they live. But there's a lot of now these little things where Hong Kong is being less of what it used to be. I don't want to say it's going to be worse, but it's certainly evolving too. And will Singapore evolve in a way where they get a competitive advantage over Hong Kong in certain areas? I think that story is unfolding.
Well, I think we've run a little bit long, but it's time for that free lunch. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, panelists. It was a pleasure. Bye. Yeah.